Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to talk about something that maybe you've noticed as a big issue whenever you're on social media. Maybe you noticed when you're in the office, maybe you noticed in the house. You know, you've got all these different things where people come and they get into a fight, and I've got my beliefs, you got yours, and now we're going to go at it. And instead of actually, working through it, we fight because, we just sometimes don't know what classical argumentation is. Sometimes it's like, oh, I got an argument with my friend. Did you? Or did you get into a fight? So today I want to talk about the difference between fighting and classical argumentation, and why it's important to get back to the concept of classical argumentation, and why it's important to discuss the need for it in today's society, and how much things would be so much better if we could figure out how to get back to classical argumentation. So if you have too many fights with your friends, with family members, with coworkers, with a significant other, maybe it's time to start thinking about, how do I get into a mode of classical argumentation? So as always, let's take a quick moment to break down a definition, and then we're going to take the rest of the time going through this definition word by word to figure out, am I doing this? And figure out, what am I doing wrong? Now, to be fair, to start off, both people have to be committed to this. So feel free to share this with someone you're having issues with and work through it together. This is not a pointing fingers, I'm doing it right, you're doing it wrong thing. It's a, here's how we can both come to a better understanding of each other and maybe not be fighting so much. So again, sit down and share this with somebody, or just copy the link and send it your own way, or hit the share button. Either way, pass this one along. So let's look at the definition that I'm going to be using for this. And that is that classical argumentation is stating beliefs backed by fact and reason, while respectfully and critically listening and considering alternative, but not always opposing, viewpoints in order to make a determination about an issue. Now, if you didn't write that down fast enough, you can always rewind, or just hang on. We're going to go through it word by word. So let's start from the beginning. Stating beliefs. That in itself is controversial these days. You are allowed to have beliefs. You're allowed to state them. In an era of cancel culture, and I think we're kind of getting past that for the most part, but it's still alive and well, hasn't been killed yet. So the idea that you can have beliefs and state them is controversial in some cases, but you're allowed to have them. It doesn't mean there's going to be repercussions and stuff, obviously, but you're allowed to have beliefs and you can state them. But the key part to this definition is the next part that comes along. Stating beliefs backed by fact and reason. Because we can't argue emotion, we can't argue opinion. So I often tell my students, I ask, how many of you like Coke better than Pepsi? And some raise their hands, and I say, well, you're wrong. Well, how do we argue that? Personally, I prefer the taste of Pepsi. So when I take a drink, it goes over my tongue, and it sends a signal to my brain. A chemical reaction happens, the electrical process happens into my brain, and I say, this tastes really good. And if I drink Coke, I'm like, that's pretty good too, but I like Pepsi better. Again, unless we can figure out how to do a tongue and brain transplant, we just can't have that kind of discussion, because that's my personal opinion. So it's important that if I'm going to state my belief, I'm going to also back it by fact and reason, because that's the only way that we can have a true discussion. So I'm going to back it up by fact and reason. I bring my facts, you bring your facts. I have a reason system that I move through my facts, and you have a reason system that goes through your facts, and we can work through this together that way. So stating beliefs backed by fact and reason. There's the first part, the first two parts. The next part is tricky too, because it's while respectfully and critically listening. Let's break that down. So respectfully, this is also a hard part, because whenever I'm listening, boy, I want to come up with an answer. Oh, I want to shoot back with something. Oh, I want to interrupt and say what I want to say. Or I'm thinking, boy, as soon as they're done talking, I'm going to get them with this zinger. That's not listening. That's thinking while they're listening and I'm coming up with something else that I want to say. So I'm going to be respectful of you. I'm going to listen. Even if I don't like what I'm hearing, even if I'm offended by what I'm hearing, I'm going to be respectful and listen because you are allowed to have your beliefs and state them. So I have to respect that, and I have to let you say that, because when the turnaround happens, I expect you to respectfully listen to me too. So we're going to have that, both sides thing. I need to be able to respectfully listen to you. You need to be able to respectfully listen to me. But it's not just respectful listening, though. Not like I'm turning off my brain. It's critical listening. So again, with critical listening, as we talked before with listening on a previous podcast, the idea of listening, I have that idea where I'm taking what you said and it's going into my head and it's sloshing against things I've learned, things I've experienced, things I've been taught, things like that are going through my head. I'm saying like, that makes sense, or that doesn't make sense and this is why. And that's an interesting concept, or whoa, that's something I hadn't thought about before, or this is a new piece of information for me. Whatever's going on in your head as you're hearing them. So again, I'm being respectful and I'm listening to you, but I'm also, thinking my way through it, and working through that. So I'm not just mindless, but I'm not coming up with some hot retort. I'm critically listening to what you say and letting it bounce through all my gray matter up there. So that's my next part. Now, the next part's also interesting because I'm going to consider alternative viewpoints. This is always a hard one because so many people, it's my way or the highway. That's it. There's no let's work through it, or let me possibly open myself to the idea, because we don't like to be wrong. We definitely don't like to admit that we're wrong. So I don't want to even consider your viewpoint. A person who cares about argumentation will say, I'm going to consider your viewpoint. Now, what's important is I said consider. I didn't say you're going to adopt or believe. You have to be willing to consider it. That, okay, I understand what you're saying, and I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm working through what you're saying as I'm critically listening, and I can see why that's a thing. Again, I'm considering it. Now, it could very well be that it's like, whoa, I never thought of that before, and I'm considering it and like, wow, that's actually a better idea than mine. That happens all the time. Again, if you're willing to listen, if I'm willing to respectfully and critically listen, as soon as I start to consider something, it might be a good thing. Now, if you don't want to change your opinion, I don't want to change my mind. I don't want to be influenced. You're going to be stopped cold right there. So it's important to be in a position where you are, I'm willing to consider. Now, the other thing too that says considering alternative viewpoints, but not always opposing, because that's another thing. There's so many times that we think it's an either or, and we fall into that logical fallacy of the false dilemma, dilemma. So we have this false dilemma or a false dichotomy or whatever you want. The either or fallacy is sometimes called. So it's either this or this. It's like, well, there are other ways. There's maybe this one over here, or this one over here, or this one way up here. We have all these different ways. Just like we're thinking, how do I get to Walmart in my town? I can go this way. I can go this way. I can go this way. I mean, I could drive all the way over here and come around this way. But they'll get you to Walmart. But they're just different ways of getting there. So an opposing, an alternative viewpoint, again, not always opposing, but an alternative viewpoint may be one that is different, that you just didn't realize I could go that way. And then, how many times have you ever had an argument, or pardon me, a fight with somebody, and you said, oh, wait a minute, we both agree on the same thing, we just looked at it from a different way. Well, duh, that's the problem right here, because you think there's a way, instead of saying, well, you can go this way, you can go this way, you can go around this way, you can go around this way, and it still gets there. So again, I'm going to consider alternative viewpoints, but they're not always opposing. It could just be a different way of looking at things. And a lot of times we get ourselves hung up with that either or fallacy. So it's amazing how much you can learn if you're willing to open yourself up to a possibility that there could be some alternative way to do the same thing that you want to do. So that's one thing to think about with this definition. The next part, it says, in order to make a determination about an issue. This is also a very tricky part, because when we talk about the idea of argumentation, we think of winning. I'm going to win this argument. Well, that's fun and all if you're trying to win, but if you're trying to maintain a relationship, what did you win by beating the other person down? We're going to try to make a determination about an issue. So we're both going to respectfully listen. We're both going to share our thoughts, back them by fact and reason. We're going to consider. We're going to be critical of the thoughts and work through them. And then we're going to make a determination. And it could be at the end of the day, I say, whoa, I was wrong. Your idea is better. Or we might come up with an idea where you say that I was right and your idea was wrong. Or we could say that, well, both of our ideas were wrong. There's actually this other way that's even better. We could have that kind of situation unfold. Or there's even another way that we typically don't do much anymore because it's a kind of a lost art. And that's the idea to agree to disagree. How many times have you seen people decide we need to fight to the death over this issue? And even if our friendship blows up, that's fine because we're going to come up with an answer. Well, the answer might be, hey, we just disagree. Like I said with opinion, like Coke people are going to think their thing, Pepsi people are going to think their thing, whatever. Ford people are going to think their way and Chevy people are going to think their way, whatever. They've got their opinions. But at the end of the day, when you're really doing classical argumentation, you're wrestling with something, you just might be in a situation where, look, you haven't swayed me. And the other person hasn't been swayed either. And we just agree to disagree. And that's just the way it is. Now, that's hard because we are used to, especially in America, we're very competitive. We like to be in a situation where someone is declared the winner. And they ring the bell, they raise your hand that you're the one that won, and then you can parade around and do your celebration, and they let off the balloons and drop the confetti, all that kind of stuff. But, it's not always the case. Sometimes it just doesn't work. Think about discussions with politics. There are people who are entrenched on their side. What are you going to do? Convince them to change? Probably not. It's just not, it's not likely, which is why whenever they go with politics, there's that 40% to believe on the left side of an issue and the 40% on the right side of an issue. It's that 20% in the middle that they're always fighting for. The people who are undecided, the people who just float around, the people who are uninformed, everyone who's in that 20% bucket, they're trying to get them to nudge one way or nudge another, which is why when you look at most political races, they're decided by a few percent at, like at least at the presidential level, So you see like a couple percent here, a couple percent there. You very rarely see a blowout. I mean, our last blowout was 1984 when Reagan won 49 states. Since then, there just hasn't really been a blowout. It's just been percentages, single digit percentage one way or another, because they've swayed these people. These people and these people aren't moving. They're staying on their side and they're staying on their side, and you're not going to do anything. It's just a question of whether they're motivated to come out and vote or suppressed so they choose to stay home. But it's this group in the middle that are trying to get them to move one way or another. So you have the situation where, they're not going to be swayed. So you just agree to disagree, but that's okay. I mean, because the problem that we've seen in recent elections is people who they're deep on this side or deep on this side, and they end friendships, they end relationships. You've seen situations where marriages end because one wanted to vote one way and one wanted to vote the other way, and they ended their marriage over something like that. I mean, that's tragic. I mean, it's tragic that you would walk away and dissolve any kind of friendship over a decision that we couldn't come to a conclusion on. Now, there are some decisions that are, heavily moral that maybe you do go to that kind of extreme on. But, if you're following classical argumentation, at least you're making a genuine effort to see where do we go. Now, here's where it really comes into play is when you start looking at like Aristotle and his idea of enlightenment and understanding an issue. This is critical when it comes to the idea of classical argumentation, because someone like Cicero, where we get most of our legal mind work from across the world, especially in the West, Cicero spoke heavily on argumentation, for the idea of winning. So like when you go to court, you're structuring your argument right so you can win. So you can see why legal minds, have read Cicero, focused on Cicero, and he's very good with that. But if we're looking on moving beyond that to some higher plane of being smarter, being more enlightened, that's where Aristotle's model tends to help us. And that's, of course, where we get most of our educational system across the West, through Aristotle. So if you think about the idea of moving to that higher level, and again, when you hear the word philosophy, sometimes people gloss over or think, oh, that's just weird people just sit in books all day. But philosophy broken down is the love of wisdom, phileo and sophia, the love of wisdom. So I love wisdom. So philosophy. For me to learn, for me to understand, I have to, basically let down my guard. I have to suppress my pride to be right and say, I want to learn more. So if I walk into a situation with you and we have a conversation and we get to a point where there's gridlock and we go through this classical argumentation model, what a win. I mean, even if I, at the end of the conversation, say, well, I was wrong, your idea is better. First of all, think how much humility it takes to do that, because we hate being wrong. We hate being admitting that someone else might be right. If two, that's even worse. It's one thing if we grumble and admit it behind closed doors, but when we say it out loud to the other person that I was wrong, you were right. From an Aristotelian standpoint, think how wonderful that is. At the end of me saying what I want to say, you saying what you want to say, I now know more about you. And we know each other better. And you know what I think about something. I know what you think about something. I know more because you use fact and reason about what you're thinking. And because I use fact and reason, you know more about my subject matter. So I'm now smarter. You're now smarter. I know you better. You know me better. That's fantastic. So to Aristotle, that's enlightenment. That's understanding. I mean, what a wonderful thing that it's not just a, haha, I beat you. It's a, wow, I know you. Think how that changes relationships instantly from I won to I know you. So I know people and I have friends and I talk with friends. And there are some friends that I know on a surface level. There's some friends I know on a fairly decent level. And there's a few that I know on a really deep level. So you think like a best friend. Those are the ones where you've had the most interaction, the most arguments, actual argumentation. We've actually worked through and I told you what I believe and why I believe it. You told me what you believe and why you believe it. And we work through it and we choose the friendship is more important than the fight. And then as a result, we end up knowing more about each other. And boy, that really cements that idea of who we are and what we believe and what the other person believes. That's a glorious thing, and we should be happy when that kind of thing happens. It's also why we only have a few really good friends and one best friend, because truly, well, by definition, you can only have one best friend, but the really close friends that you have, think how much time and effort it takes to go through all of your things that you believe, why you believe it, and then patiently listen to them talk about what they believe and why they believe it. And then we wrestle with it and discuss it. I mean, that takes a lot of time, and you can't do that with every single person you bump across, all the people you've ever worked with, all the people you've ever met. That's just too much. So it would take a ton of time, and we just don't have the time to do that. So instead, there are people that we say, okay, we have like 85% in common. Let's spend more time talking and wrestling with things. Whereas this person, we may have 10% in common. We might wrestle with it a little bit, but we're not going to go too far just because, we just don't have a lot in common and it just doesn't fit real well. And then the last thing that really comes into play with doing this classical argumentation is it helps you know your own beliefs better. I mean, the idea that if I can articulate with fact and reason what I believe, that means I have to be thinking pretty deeply about it. And I'm willing to hear other people and come up with their facts and reasons on why they think they're right, and we're wrestling with this stuff. It's going to sharpen my knowledge. Biblically, you hear about the idea, you read about the idea of iron sharpening iron. And this is basically the idea. So if I'm solidly understanding what I believe and someone else is solidly understanding what they believe, and we're going at it, it's going to sharpen each other. It doesn't mean we're going to be sharpened and more opposed. Like I said, we could still agree to disagree, or we could sway one to the other. But you're going to have this sharpening effect to where what you believe is going to get more finely honed. For a knife to get sharp, it has to be you can't put it across pudding and expect it to get sharp. You have to put it against a sharpening stone or a sharpening iron to take off those burrs, to get rid of the waste, to get sharper and sharper and sharper until that baby is just perfectly razor sharp and can just slice through things easily. A good discussion with people will do that, even if it's someone with a different viewpoint, because you will be forced to stand your ground and with fact and reason defend what you believe. So if you follow these steps, this definition of classical argumentation with people, and again, they both have to, both of you have to be in on it. It can't just be one who follows it and one who likes to yell and curse and scream things at you. That's not going to work. You need to have both sides doing classical argumentation. But if you move into this mindset, you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be able to resolve things a lot better, and you're going to keep your friends while doing it, and you're going to develop richer, deeper friendships. And that's something we should hope and work towards. We should love the fact that we are working out things with our friends instead of just fighting and then ending in a huff and then we don't speak again. That's what I have for you today. Thank you very much for tuning in. And as always, please like, share, or subscribe to my channel. And also, if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. We can bring fact and reason and discuss why you didn't like it. But thanks for tuning in this long anyway. That's what I have for you today here on Communicology.